4 weeks ago, Starship came down in one piece out in the ocean. And this week, the story of actually getting it home just took a genuinely interesting turn. At the same time, we've got fresh static fire action to talk through as the countdown towards Starship's next flight keeps ticking forward. Although there's one piece of that plan that's a bit of a letdown. We're also still holding out hope that this next mission ends up being the first fully orbital run for the vehicle. And on top of all of that, it's been another wild week in the wider space world, including a rocket that is absolutely not a Falcon 9 pulling off something that looks a lot like one, and a major Russian rocket manufacturing site getting hit in a strike that's going to have ripple effects well beyond the war it's part of. Yeah, it's been a week. Let's get into it. We have to start with the still ongoing saga of Ship 40, because it's honestly the most interesting thread running through the last month. After splashing down in one piece and then spending weeks bobbing around the Indian Ocean, SpaceX confirmed this week that they'd managed to guide the vehicle to Christmas Island, a small speck of land roughly 600 kilometers off the Australian coast, where the ship has finally been able to sit still long enough for the team to rest, resupply, and actually put together a real recovery plan. On a personal note, I had a genuinely fun week putting this episode together, because I managed to connect on Tuesday morning with Chris Bray, an international wildlife photographer who happens to be based right there on the island. Getting to break some of this news alongside him was a real treat, and if you haven't seen his work, it's worth a look. He runs incredible photography tours and puts out fantastic footage on his own channel. I've genuinely been going through his free photography course myself, because I could use the help. I'll drop links to his Instagram and YouTube in the description, so go show him some support. There's going to be more to this story as the Ship 40 saga continues to play out. One of the more interesting details to come out of this recovery effort is exactly how they've been moving the ship around. It looks like they're using the ship's own sea-level Raptor engine as a tow point. That's a genuinely clever use of hardware that earns its nickname more than usual this week. Even Elon Musk chimed in publicly, agreeing that this engine had turned out to be a sea-level engine, in a much more literal sense than anyone expected. Before this, the working assumption was that any tow line would hook into the ship's clamping hardware. But attaching to the engine actually makes a lot of engineering sense once you consider the kind of loads this structure was built to survive during ascent and the flip maneuver. Pulling a 50-meter steel ship through open ocean isn't exactly gentle either. As for how the ship itself has held up physically, the honest answer is pretty well, all things considered. A month bobbing in salt water is rough. It's corrosive and abrasive, and you can see some wear on both the steel skin and the heat shield tiles across the vehicle. But the payload door still looks sealed, and the hull appears to have stayed essentially watertight the whole time, which is a genuinely impressive outcome for a vehicle that was never designed with a month-long ocean voyage in mind. Here's hoping the next installment of SpaceX's official docuseries covers this whole saga properly, because there's clearly a lot more to the story than we're seeing from the outside. Christmas Island itself has its own small dock and airstrip, and a team of SpaceX engineers is already on the way out there to begin a proper inspection of the ship now that it's sitting in calmer water. And to be clear, the plan is still to bring Ship 40 all the way back to Starbase in Texas. This isn't a write-off. So how exactly are they going to move a 50-meter steel rocket across an ocean? While I was still scanning shipping data trying to spot the vessel that would do the job, the tracking account Interstellar Gateway beat me to it, catching a ship called Forte en route to Christmas Island, expected to arrive Sunday afternoon. Good catch on their part. And take a look at what kind of vessel this actually is, because it's a semi-submersible heavy-lift ship, essentially built to sink itself low enough in the water to float cargo directly onto its deck before rising back up underneath it. As it happens, I've actually seen a very similar vessel in person, one called Black Marlin, right here in Tasmania, and the size class is almost identical, around 216 meters long and 43 meters wide, more than large enough to carry a 50-meter Starship. That Tasmanian sighting, for what it's worth, was carrying hull 096, an enormous vessel built by Incat right here in my home state. Massive respect to that team, since it's the largest battery electric ship ever built, and it shipped out just a few weeks ago. Assuming Fort really is headed there for Ship 40, and it's hard to imagine another reason a ship like that would be steaming toward Christmas Island, the plan appears to be to load the Starship aboard and carry it roughly 25,500 kilometers, or about 13,700 nautical miles, back to Texas. My guess is they'll route around the major canals rather than through them, but either way, we're looking at somewhere between 43 and 48 days at sea, so this saga isn't wrapping up anytime soon. Meanwhile, back at Starbase, things had looked a little quiet on the surface over the past few weeks, while the team quietly prepped the next two vehicles for the upcoming flight. That changed once all the Raptor 3 engines were finally bolted onto Ship 41. The static fire stand rolled out to the ring yard on Tuesday morning, and by that evening the ship had been moved into Mega Bay 2. Not long after, Ship 41 headed out for its static fire, And given that it had been sitting since its cryogenic proof test more than 7 weeks earlier, this felt like a long time coming for anyone who, let's be honest, struggles with patience during these stretches. The ship rolled out over the flame trench at the Massey's test site to get ready for the real fireworks. Just 19 hours after arriving, it was already frosting up with cryogenic propellant. It went through the same roughly 25-minute hold that Ship 40 had done before it, and then, right on schedule, we got a clean ignition and burn on a single Raptor engine. This one pulling propellant from the header tank specifically to simulate an in-space relight, which matters a lot, given that this flight is meant to be the first attempt at a full orbital mission. You could also see the newly upgraded purge system firing on the test stand during this run. SpaceX actually described this particular test as a deorbit burn test for the first time, which tells you exactly what they're rehearsing for. That was followed on Friday night by the full 6-engine static fire, a smooth, roughly minute-long burn. And this time the footage was framed a bit further back so you could really take in the scale of the exhaust plume lighting up the night. Now, as much as we're hoping this flight becomes the first to reach a genuine full orbit, carrying a stack of version 3 Starlink satellites, there's a bit of a letdown buried in this week's updates. SpaceX confirmed there will be no attempt to catch this particular ship at the tower on Pad 2. In fact, it might be a little more disappointing than that, since the current language from the company suggests they're now aiming to probably attempt a tower catch in a few months, which likely pushes that milestone past the following flight as well. There doesn't appear to be any regulatory holdup behind this. No, it just sounds like SpaceX isn't ready yet. It's a bit of a shock, but even without a booster catch attempt, this flight, aiming for that first full orbital run while they work on nailing a soft splashdown instead, is still shaping up to be a genuinely exciting one. On the super heavy side, Booster 21 is sitting in Mega Bay 1 and should be getting close to beginning its own static fire campaign. The main holdup seems to have been construction work around the launch mount, but thanks to aerial photography from the RGV team, we can see that the scaffolding down in the flame trench has been cleared out, revealing the shape and placement of a set of brand new burn plates the team has been welding in. It'll be worth watching how those hold up once Flight 14 actually happens. Since we still haven't seen Booster 21 roll out for its own static fire yet, it feels like we're still a handful of weeks out from that. We'll get a better read on the timeline as next Saturday approaches. Elsewhere on the tower, the booster quick disconnect hoods are getting some cosmetic and protective work too. The scorched coating from the last flight has been ground off and a fresh coat applied, so that hardware is looking clean again. Further up, more cladding tabs are appearing along the tower structure, seemingly stopping right around the ship's quick disconnect arm. Once that cladding is fully installed, it'll give the various commodity lines running up through the tower some real protection from the exhaust plume of returning vehicles. There's also some new welding happening down at the tower's base, adding extra plates over the mounting bolts. That matters because when Starship pitches away from the tower right after liftoff, the exhaust plume gets funneled straight down into the gap between the launch mount and the tower base, which acts as a kind of makeshift flame diverter, but also means those bolts have been taking direct heat exposure on every launch, over enough flights that would eventually erode them past a safe point, so this reinforcement should put a stop to that. You may have also noticed the bright red and white FAA-mandated navigation lights partway up and at the very top of Tower 1, required by law so low-flying aircraft don't wander into the area in poor visibility. This week, those lights were switched off on Pad 1's tower, which is now sitting dark, and the same lighting duty is shifted over to Tower 2, which looks like it'll remain the primary active tower for a good while, as Pad 1 continues its upgrade work. Speaking of which, remember the sections being trimmed off the ends of the tower arms recently? That whole section has now been removed entirely and replaced with a new one that already has the extra reinforcement built into its base. Worth remembering that these arms used to be considerably longer. The section that got removed had an actuator that raised and lowered the landing rail. Now that the arms are shorter, that spot will instead house a damper designed to cushion and compress against any incoming vehicle during landing. Sponsor segment. Insert your own read here. Back to the new orbital launch mount going up for Pad 1. Construction at the Sanchez site has clearly kicked back into gear. All 8 sections of the bottom ring are now in place and at least tack welded together to hold their position, and the crew has already begun stacking the second middle layer on top. Alongside that, the first manifold has been mounted onto the construction jib for one of the 2 water deluge buckets, with the associated piping already staged nearby. There's plenty happening on the vehicle side of things too. Booster 22, which is slated for the following flight, finished stacking this week, and footage from NASA Spaceflight's live cameras caught its methane tank being lifted out of the middle of Mega Bay 1. True to SpaceX's usual pace, less than an hour later, the first 3 sections of the next booster in line, Booster 23, presumably destined for the flight after that, started showing up. First the common dome, then shortly after, the first 2 sections of the liquid oxygen tank. Looking closer at that common dome, You can actually spot one of the first visible hardware changes to this version of the vehicle since production began. The ring of stringers around the dome now has sloped tops rather than flat ones, a change that should reduce drag during ascent. No need to worry about the equivalent stringers on the other side of the vehicle, though, since during re-entry, that extra drag is actually the point. On the upper stage side, with Ship 41 having finished its business at Massey's, Ship 42 wasn't left alone in Mega Bay 2 for long. Ship 43's nose cone, payload bay dispenser, and forward dome all rolled out of the tall Star Factory door and made their way over to begin its own stacking process. Production is clearly starting to pick up pace, even if it won't hit full speed until the giant building housing it all is finished, and that building is getting close. This week brought a nice milestone. The very last horizontal roof truss section was lifted into place, and the team climbed up to take a group photo to mark the occasion. From the outside, the cladding is nearly reaching the top of the structure, with roofing sheet metal already going up above that. You might recall SpaceX had started removing the parapet wall along the edge of the Star Factory a few weeks back. That's to allow construction of an extension linking it to the Gigabay, and you can already see steel being staged and moved into position for that connection. There was also a smaller but interesting delivery spotted near the Gigabay, what looked like 2 brand new grid fin adapters. It's a bit speculative for now, but the working theory is that these are meant for the breakover process, used to lay a super heavy booster down horizontally for transport, something we haven't really seen after all these years of building everything vertically. Based on the design, these should give the lifting rig a full 180 degrees of movement, letting it rotate the booster 90 degrees in either direction. Falcon territory had a genuinely wild week too, and when I say back-to-back, I mean it almost literally. Falcon 9 set a new record for the shortest gap between 2 separate launches, with 2 boosters lighting up the sky from opposite coasts of the country under 40 minutes apart. The first went up Saturday evening from Space Launch Complex 40, carrying the Globalstar 2R Mission 1 payload. Booster 1090 flew its 14th mission, and unusually for a mission that wasn't a Starlink flight, we got a good look at the short, vacuum-optimized Merlin nozzle, a version that trades a bit of efficiency for lower manufacturing cost, thanks to using less material on the engine bell. The payload was light enough this time that SpaceX had the performance margin to bring the booster all the way back to land, rather than out to a drone ship, touching down at landing zone 40 just seconds before the upper stage hit its target orbit. A genuinely rare treat to see one of these return-to-launch site landings happen in broad daylight. While that mission was still live, SpaceX kicked off a second stream in parallel for a Falcon 9 counting down from the West Coast. Daylight there too, despite the 3-hour time difference thanks to the timing. This one was a classified U.S. Space Force mission, USSF 366, flying on Booster 1088's 18th trip. Without visibility into the second stage after separation, all we got to watch was the booster landing successfully on the drone ship. Of course, I still love you, and the stream wrapped up there, right as everyone was still waiting on confirmation that the 8 Globalstar satellites from the earlier mission had deployed. They did, and interestingly, all 8 were built on Rocket Lab's Lightning satellite platform. There's a great shot from one of them already in orbit, and it's a genuinely striking image. Starlink kept the pace going too. Group 1750 launched Tuesday evening on Booster 1097's 12th flight, another mission out of Vandenberg, meaning, of course, I Still Love You was back in action almost immediately. Then Group 1039 launched Friday morning from Space Launch Complex 40, with Booster 1078 landing for the 30th time. There was even a 5th Falcon 9 mission booked for later that same day, just hours after this episode went live, which tells you exactly how relentless the cadence has become. On a smaller but genuinely neat side note, remember the old Falcon 9 upper stage that intentionally impacted the lunar surface earlier this month? The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has now sent back imagery of the actual impact site, and you can clearly make out a fresh crater roughly 18 meters across and just under 3 meters deep, along with the ejecta pattern scattered around it. It's a small thing, but it's a genuinely cool reminder of how much visibility we now have into events like this. And honestly, this kind of imaging is only going to get more routine as the industry keeps accelerating. Now here's something that, at a glance, might make you do a double take, because it is not a Falcon 9, even though it sure looks like one. Chinese company Landspace flew their Zhuque 3 rocket this week, a methane-fueled vehicle with a reusable first stage. Where Falcon 9 burns RP-1, essentially refined kerosene, Zhuque 3 runs on the cleaner burning methane, which is exactly why its exhaust plume looks a lot closer to Starship's than to Falcon 9's. It flies with 9 TQ-12A engines on the first stage, and a single TQ-15 vacuum engine on the second, and structurally it's built primarily from stainless steel rather than the aluminum-lithium alloy Falcon 9 uses. In other words, it borrows design cues from more than one corner of SpaceX's playbook. This was only the rocket's second flight, carrying the Honghu R03 internet satellite as its payload. On the first flight, Landspace didn't even attempt a landing. This time, though, roughly 7.5 minutes after liftoff, the booster came down at landing site number 1, about 390 kilometers downrange, and it actually stuck the landing. You can clearly see it throttle down from 3 engines to just the center one before deploying its landing legs, and honestly, it looked almost too smooth. It's nowhere near as aggressive as Falcon 9's suicide burn profile, but I'd expect them to keep tightening that up over time. That success makes Zhukui 3 China's first commercial rocket to both reach orbit and successfully recover its first stage on solid ground, though the celebration was slightly undercut when the booster tipped over a short time later after a fire weakened one of its 4 landing legs. Even with that asterisk, it's still the first rocket ever to land on solid ground for a Chinese company. The Long March 10B pulled off its own recovery milestone just last month. But that one used an unusual cable capture system over open ocean rather than a proper touchdown on land. This can be a touchy subject for some people to talk about, but regardless of how anyone feels about the political backdrop, it's worth paying attention to the pace this technology is advancing at. Falcon 9 proved all of this over a decade ago, and there's no getting around the fact that this design is heavily inspired by that work. Still, it's real competition building toward the moon and beyond, and it's exactly why I'd like to see the US keep growing its annual space budget rather than let the gap close. One thing that genuinely bothers me right now is the plan to retire the International Space Station within the next 4 years, while China already has a brand new station of its own up and running continuously. All I can really say is, here's hoping the commercial successors to the ISS come online sooner rather than later. Speaking of the station, there's been plenty of spacewalk activity recently. NASA astronauts Jessica Meir and Anil Menon headed outside not long ago to continue prep work for installing the next set of rollout solar arrays. Anil was back outside again earlier this week for his second ever spacewalk, this time alongside ESA astronaut Sophie Adenauer, who was on her first ever spacewalk. Congratulations to her, and it's also worth noting she's now the first French woman to complete one. The job for this particular walk was replacing a failed space-to-ground antenna, and it turned out to be trickier than planned. Extra time went into disconnecting cabling and loosening stubborn bolts, which ate into the schedule enough that they didn't get to actually install the replacement unit. Instead, they removed the failed antenna, secured it to the station's truss for later disposal, and wrapped up after close to 6.5 hours outside. The actual installation of the new antenna is now planned for a future spacewalk, alongside another one coming up for general maintenance and continued decommissioning prep. Rocket Lab also had another Electron launch this week, sending up one more SAR satellite for IQPS as part of their growing constellation, a nighttime launch out of New Zealand under the mission name The Lightning God Defends. A few minutes in, there was a clean view of stage separation, followed by the kick stage completing roughly half an orbit before deploying the satellite right around the 50-minute mark. And finally, something I don't normally cover on a channel like this, but it's significant enough that it's worth a mention. You may already have heard about a missile strike roughly 900 kilometers inside Russian territory this past week. Ukrainian forces struck the Progress Rocket Space Center in Samara, one of Roscosmos's key facilities, using domestically produced FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles. President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the strike himself. The Progress facility is responsible for producing Russia's Soyuz 2 rockets, including the newer Soyuz 5, along with a range of military satellites. It's still not entirely clear how much damage was done, but Roscosmos was already struggling to keep up with Soyuz production demand before this, so if the damage turns out to be significant, it could add real pressure to that pipeline, including Russia's ability to keep flying crew to the International Space Station. It really does say something that SpaceX's Crew Dragon has quietly racked up 7 years of reliable service, because if Starliner were the only other option sitting on the shelf right now, the ISS crew rotation picture would look a lot shakier. If the Soyuz situation does become a real bottleneck, it wouldn't be surprising to see NASA lean on SpaceX for extra cosmonaut seats down the line. Curious what you all think about that. And that's a wrap for this week, folks. Thanks so much for sticking with me through all of it. If you enjoyed the episode, a subscribe genuinely helps keep these going. If you've got a bit more time and want to keep the space content rolling, there's another video linked right after this one worth checking out. Appreciate you watching all the way to the end. I'll catch you next weekend.